Hello, and thank you for joining me for another FPSE tech analysis. This time, looking at the newly released Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin demo, which dropped today on Nintendo Switch. This marks the second major Monster Hunter release on Switch this year, after the excellent Monster Hunter Rise, which was a great technical showpiece for the system. All eyes are on Capcom, while Stories 2 has a completely different visual style. Can they match or exceed the expectations set by Rise? Let's find out together. Covering the basics first, Stories 2 seems to run at a very raw 900p while docked. That is 1600 horizontal pixels by 900 vertical pixels. This may use a dynamic resolution solution, as one of my pixel counts came out at 1536 by 864, but for the most part it seemed to be 900p. It's also worth noting that the image presented is very raw. There does not appear to be any kind of temporal anti-aliasing solution as we saw in Rise, so it's quite a jagged picture. In Portable then, we get what appears to be a native 1280 by 720, which looks gorgeous and crisp on the Switch's screen. It's definitely still full of sawtooth edges, but it works okay with the quite cartoony look of Stories 2. Next, the tech. Stories 2 features a quite detailed character creator, so a lot of the cutscenes seem to be in engine, which is great to see. I imagine these will scale very well with the eventual PC version. These cutscenes are beautifully lit and directed, which is good as there's quite a lot of them. The game has quite a cartoony look, with crisp cell lighting, and the textures, while not super detailed, work well within the image. The game appears to use a low-grade anisotropic filtering, which you can see here on the ground in this screenshot. Not too far away from the camera, it resolves into a blurry smear. There's also a lot of edge shimmer due to the lack of temporal anti-aliasing, but I think overall the image is very aesthetically pleasing. Animations are beautifully done, with the combat animations full of personality. The in-engine cutscenes showcase really high-quality models, and the animation, with plenty of physics objects in the background, brings a lot of life to the world. Moving on to performance, this is where Stories 2 stumbles a little bit. The game appears to run at a completely uncapped frame rate, meaning that frame times, the metric used to measure frame consistency, bounce wildly between 16.6 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds. Ideally, for a 30 frames per second game, you want those to be consistently 33.3 milliseconds, but the consistency just isn't there. To be clear, this isn't a 60 FPS game. While the frame rate can occasionally go above 30 FPS in limited circumstances, for the most part you're looking at somewhere in the range of 20 FPS in cutscenes to around 31 FPS in gameplay. This lack of consistency extends to all aspects of gameplay, as you can see here in this combat sequence. While it holds mostly around 30 FPS, both yours and the enemy attacks can cause minor disruptions to the frame rate. And then there are the spikes above 33 milliseconds every so often, wherein a new frame will be shown for a tiny window. It never looks quite smooth because of this, despite the average frame rate being around 30 FPS usually. Cutscenes, on the other hand, suffer from heavy drops, particularly when there are large alpha effects, such as fire or smoke, filling up much of the viewport. However, as these sequences are not interactive, it's not too bad, just definitely noticeable. All of these drops tend to be a little worse in handheld too. I would say that generally speaking, performance is better during gameplay on the handheld, but cutscenes seem about the same or worse. It looks like Stories 2 is pushing the Switch hardware just a little bit too much in both configurations. There's also one more issue I'd like to touch on, which is that the camera controls feel like they were created by someone who's never used the right stick to control the camera before. By default, the sensitivity is quite high, but there's an acceleration curve that makes it really difficult to move the camera slowly or smoothly, even on the lowest settings. So where does Stories 2 stand? Personally, I think Capcom have delivered a gorgeous game, although it's not as consistent performance-wise as Monster Hunter Rise, which might be expected given that these are very different games. It feels technically quite ambitious despite the cartoony visuals, and I'm curious to see if Capcom will be able to fix any of these issues by the game's launch. I think adding an optional 30 frames per second cap to ensure even frame pacing would make the product feel a lot more polished. And that's that for today. If you've enjoyed today's video, please give it a like, subscribe to FPSE, and leave a comment. I love reading them, and they give me a lot of motivation to keep going. That's me, signing off.